Hello everyone! First, I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this gathering. When I was first asked to speak about Mary Magdalene, my immediate thought was, well, there's probably people here a lot more qualified than I am. Because I'm not a historian, I'm not a theologian, I'm a philosopher, but I don't read Greek and I don't read Aramaic. And despite what the internet occasionally thinks, I don't have a secret underground vault filled with lost manuscripts. I'm just a woman who asks a lot of questions. Sometimes more questions than people are comfortable with. And that's actually part of how I ended up here. Because if there's one thing that I've learned through studying Mary Magdalene, it's that many of us don't arrive at her through certainty. It's usually through questions. Because something inside of us senses that there is more to the story, more to her story, more to our story, and maybe even more to the story that we've been told about ourselves. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Desiree, but I'm known as Wild Mother online through Mojavean Wolf. I create content surrounding spirituality, history, deconstruction, symbolism, Christ consciousness, and the long winding path of trying to separate genuine spiritual truth from human institutions. And over the last year, I've begun to dive deep into some of these lesser known traditions surrounding Mary Magdalene. Not just the Mary Magdalene most of us grew up hearing about, but the Mary Magdalene that's preserved in Gnostic traditions. The Mary Magdalene who appears as teacher and initiate, bearer of wisdom and a companion, student and a leader. And depending on which tradition you're reading, sometimes even more mysterious. The deeper I dug into these stories, the more fascinated I became. I kept finding themes that felt strangely familiar. Themes of exile, of authority, of wisdom. Themes of women being misunderstood, of women being blamed. Themes of women carrying truth that make powerful people uncomfortable. And eventually I realized something. I wasn't just studying Mary Magdalene. I was recognizing pieces of my own journey in hers. Now, before I go any further, I want to make something very clear. This isn't going to be a presentation where I sit here and attempt to prove every Gnostic tradition as historical fact. As much as I would love to do that, I think that conversation does have value, but it isn't the conversation that I came here to have today. The conversation I came here to have is much more personal, because for most of my life, I thought my spiritual journey was about finding God. And in many ways it was, but I look back now and I realize something else was happening too. While I was searching for truth, Mary Magdalene kept showing up. Not all at once, not dramatically with flashing lights and heavenly choirs, just quietly, like a thread woven between the background of my life. And the funny thing is if you would have met me 20 years ago, I never would have expected that. 20 years ago, I was a church girl. I believed what I was taught. I trusted the people I was told to trust. I followed the rules. I genuinely wanted to be good. I genuinely wanted to serve God. And I genuinely believed that if I did all the right things, then it would eventually make sense. And maybe that's where my story and Mary's begins to intersect, at the corner of uncertainty and innocence. Because before Mary Magdalene became a teacher or a disciple or a symbol, she was simply a young woman standing at the edge of a journey that she could not yet see. And so was I. So I wasn't raised in a perfect home, but I was raised by a woman who was trying her damnedest. And now that I'm a single mom myself, I understand my mother in ways that I never could when I was younger. My mom was raising 4 children on her own, just trying to survive, keep all of us alive, just trying to keep food on the table, just trying to make it through another week. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, she was still trying to hold on to her connection to God. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't rigid either. And this wasn't because she thought she had all the answers, but because spirit was one of the things that was helping her stay alive. As a child, I did not fully understand that. I do now. Looking back, I can see that what she gave me wasn't certainty. She gave me permission to seek. There were seasons where we attended regularly and seasons where life simply got in the way, but faith was always present in my childhood growing up in some form. The language of God was very familiar to me. The language of prayer was also familiar to me, of longing That was familiar to me. And that's important because long before I became interested in history, long before I became interested in symbolism, or before I started asking dangerous questions, I genuinely loved God. I still do. I wasn't rebelling against God. I was running towards God. And that's a distinction that I think many people miss when they hear stories like mine. People often assume that when someone leaves a religious institution, they must have wanted to leave faith itself. That was not my experience. The deeper truth is that I was desperately trying to find God. And because I was trying to find God, I became the kind of person who threw herself completely into whatever she loved. When I loved something, I loved it with my whole heart. And one of the things that I loved was music. Music was not a hobby to me. Music felt alive. It felt sacred, like connecting to God. It felt like one of the few places where heaven and earth touched. I wrote songs constantly when I was younger, played guitar, filled notebooks. I dreamed impossible dreams. And like many young people, I believed talent and hard work might actually eventually open a door for me. I didn't need fame. I didn't need fortune. I just wanted to create. I wanted my voice to matter. Literally. I wanted my songs to mean something. And at the same time, I was trying to be the good girl, the good Christian girl, the girl who followed the rules, the girl who trusted authority, the girl who believed the adults around her knew what they were doing, the girl who believed that if she stayed close to God and stayed on the right path, that she would be protected. And when I looked at some of the traditions surrounding Mary Magdalene, I can't help but wonder if she too began with this kind of innocence. Because one of the things that surprises me the most while studying these traditions is that Mary doesn't begin as a powerful spiritual teacher. She doesn't begin as a legend. She doesn't begin as an icon. She begins as a young woman, a daughter, a dreamer, someone standing at the threshold of a life that she cannot yet imagine. And in several traditions, there is this reoccurring sense that something extraordinary is attached to her destiny long before she understands it herself. And I find that fascinating because when we're young, we tend to think our lives are going to unfold in a straight line. We imagine purpose arriving neatly. We imagine wisdom arriving gently. We imagine that if we're sincere enough, life will reward us for it. But that isn't how transformation works. Transformation rarely arrives looking like wisdom. More often than not, it arrives disguised as disruption. And sometimes the very thing that shatters your life becomes the doorway to the life that you were actually meant to live. I just didn't know that yet. At 20 years old, I still believed the world would work in the way that I was taught. I still believed that authority figures were safe. I still believed that if something looked spiritual, then it probably was. I still believed that adults would protect young people. I still believed that church healed people. I still believed that dreams coming true were always a good thing. And then one Sunday afternoon after church, I met a family that would change the entire trajectory of my life. It started so innocently. Honestly, if you would have asked me at the time, I would have told you it felt like an answered prayer. One Sunday after church, a family who had recently started attending joined a large group of us for lunch. You know how church communities can be. Everyone pulls tables together, everyone knows each other, everyone is family, or at least that's what you're supposed to believe. The family was fascinating to me. The older brother was a successful musician turned producer. The younger brother was a musician too. Creative people, my kind of people, interesting people. People who seemed to be living a life much bigger than the small world that I was still living in. At the time, I was pursuing music myself. I was writing the songs, playing the guitar, dreaming about recording an album someday. So naturally, when music came up in conversation, I lit up. I shared that I had been writing my own material, and then the conversation continued. One thing led to another. And before the day was over, I found myself being invited into a professional recording studio. I was ecstatic. I remember feeling like I had been handed a golden ticket, the kind of opportunity that most aspiring musicians spend years hoping for. And if I'm being completely honest, part of me was also distracted by the younger brother. The one closer to my age, the one I actually had a crush on. Life felt exciting. Possibilities felt endless. The future felt open. At the studio, I watched musicians work. I watched songs come alive. I watched creativity become reality, and it felt like magic. And eventually, I was invited to record some rough tracks of my own music. The producer listened. He seemed impressed. He asked if I thought that I could write enough material for a full album. I told him yes, without hesitation. Absolutely yes. And then came the offer. He would help me record it. Looking back now, I can still remember exactly how that felt. I thought my dreams were finally beginning, and what I didn't realize was that something else was beginning too. Over the following months, we spent more and more time together in the studio, long nights, creative conversations, recording sessions, talking about music, talking about life, talking about dreams. And because he was married, I felt safe. That's the part people struggle to understand. I felt safe because he was married. I assumed there was a boundary already built into the situation, a boundary I didn't have to create myself, a boundary that I did not have to defend, a boundary that I thought he was going to honor. Meanwhile, people around me started saying things, not because they were worried about me, at least not in the way I needed them to be. They would say things like, "You shouldn't be alone with him. It doesn't look good. People might get the wrong idea." And what strikes me now is how nobody seemed concerned at my safety. Nobody sat me down and said, "Be careful, pay attention. Power dynamics matter. Older people with influence can misuse trust." No. The concern was appearance, the appearance of evil, not the possibility of harm, the appearance of harm. And those are not the same things. As time went on, I noticed things that felt special. He would ask for my opinion on songs that he was writing. He would play me unfinished tracks. He seemed to value my thoughts. To a young woman searching for purpose, that kind of attention feels meaningful. You think that you're being seen. You think that you're being chosen. You think you're finally finding a mentor. What you don't realize is that sometimes the thing being cultivated isn't your talent, it's your trust. And trust, once given, becomes very easy to redirect. Then came the night that changed everything. He invited me to attend a concert with him, a professional opportunity, networking, industry connections. At least that's how I understood it. So I met him at the studio, we drove together, and when we arrived, he parked his car, but instead of getting out, he stayed seated, talking and talking, and then suddenly he looks at me and he says, "God, you're so beautiful." And I still remember the feeling in my stomach, because in a single sentence, the entire illusion shattered. Everything became clear at once. The record deal, the attention, the special treatment, the private conversations, the emotional closeness. Suddenly, I was seeing something I did not want to see. And I remember looking away and saying, "No, don't do that." Because a part of me knew. A part of me knew that something had crossed a line. But another part of me was terrified. Terrified of losing the opportunity. Terrified of disappointing someone that I respected. Terrified of admitting that I had misunderstood what was happening. And if you've ever been there, you know how confusing that space can be. Because two truths can exist at the same time. You can feel uncomfortable and still want someone's approval. You can know something is wrong and still struggle to walk away. You can feel manipulated and still blame yourself. What followed was months of confusion, emotional entanglement, secrecy, shame, and choices that it would take me years to understand. But today, when I look back, I no longer see the story the way that I did when I was 20. At 20, I thought I was participating. At 40, I can finally see the power imbalance. I can finally see the difference between a young woman seeking guidance and an older man who should have known better. And maybe that's why part of Mary Magdalene's story speaks to me so deeply. In the traditions that I've been studying, Mary's life does not begin the way that most people imagine. Most of us are familiar with the version of Mary who appears beside Yeshua, the disciple, the witness, the teacher. But in these traditions, there is an entire story before that story. a story of loss, a story of violence, a story of survival. And according to these accounts, Mary was promised in marriage while she was still very young. She was placed within a caravan and she was heading towards Babylon, and somewhere along the journey, the caravan was attacked. The men were killed, the women were violated, and Mary herself was taken captive. Now, whether someone believes that story happened exactly as it's written is almost secondary to what the story is actually trying to communicate. Because notice how Mary is introduced. She's not introduced as powerful. She's not introduced as enlightened. She's not introduced as untouchable. She is, however, introduced as vulnerable. She is introduced as a young woman whose life is supposedly ripped apart, a young woman who loses the future that she thought she was moving toward, a young woman who discovers that the world is not nearly as safe as she believed it to be. And if you've ever experienced a moment where your innocence shattered, where the story you're living suddenly collapses, then you know exactly how profound these moments can be. Because something dies there. Not necessarily your spirit, but your assumptions, your certainty, your trust in how the world works. And after that, you're never quite the same person again. When I look back now, I realize that night in the parking lot was one of those moments for me. Everything I thought was happening suddenly looked different. When people hear the story I just shared, they often assume the most painful part was the relationship itself, and it wasn't. The most painful part is what came afterward, because eventually everything came to light, as it always does. One phone call, one misunderstanding, one moment where the carefully constructed illusion could no longer hold itself together. And suddenly everyone knew. The producer's wife knew, the church knew, my family knew, the leadership knew, the community knew. And if this were a story about accountability, perhaps that would be where healing began, but it wasn't. No. What happened instead was something I would spend years trying to understand. I was called into a meeting with the church leadership, people I trusted, people I looked up to, people I believed were spiritual authorities, people who, in my mind, represented the heart of Christ. And sitting there, bruised, exhausted, confused, and ashamed, I was waiting to hear whatever wisdom they would offer, whatever guidance they were going to provide, whatever healing they might help facilitate. Instead, I was told that because the producer's wife had decided to remain in the congregation to receive healing, that I was no longer welcome there. Just like that, years of attendance, years of service, years of tithing, years of believing I belonged, years of growing up in this church all through high school, gone. I remember realizing almost in real time that what I had believed was unconditional love had conditions after all. And once those conditions were broken, belonging disappeared. But it didn't stop there. My closest friends vanished. People who had promised that they loved me, people who had promised that they would stand by my side, people who knew the full story, people who knew how young I was, people who knew how complicated the situation had become. One by one, they disappeared. Years later, I would learn that many of them had been instructed not to speak to me anymore, and they obeyed. The same community that taught me that love suddenly practiced exclusion. The same community that taught forgiveness suddenly chose distance. The same community that spoke constantly about grace was now offering very little. Then came another loss. The woman whose home I was living in was also part of that church community. So the same day, she asked me to leave. So essentially, I became spiritually homeless, socially homeless, physically homeless. And the strangest part, for years, I thought the lesson was that I had failed. For years, I carried the blame exactly as it had been handed to me. For years, I believed that I was the cautionary tale, the fallen woman, the problem, the disruption, the one who brought chaos into the community. I accepted the story that they wrote about me, because when enough authority figures repeat a story, eventually you begin to repeat it yourself. But then something happened. I moved back in with my mother, and one day she said something so simple, and it changed everything. She just looked at me and said, "You know he was a wolf on the prowl, right?" And I wish I could tell you that everything clicked instantly for me in that moment. It didn't. Healing rarely works that way. But that sentence became the very first crack in the story that I carried for years, because for the first time, someone wasn't asking what I'd done. Someone was asking what had happened to me. And there is a profound difference between those two questions. What did you do? What happened to you? One assumes guilt, the other invites you to understand. One isolates you, the other one heals you. And as I began slowly untangling my own story, I found myself thinking more and more about Mary Magdalene, not simply because of what may have happened to her during her life, but because of what happened to her story after she was gone. Because exile isn't always physical. Sometimes exile happens in memory. Sometimes exile happens in history. Sometimes it happens through narrative. And Mary Magdalene may be one of the most extraordinary examples of that in Christian history. Think about it. The biblical text presents Mary as a devoted disciple, a witness to the crucifixion, to the resurrection, the first person entrusted with carrying the news that Christ had risen. Yet over the centuries, her story became entangled with ideas and identities that the biblical text itself never clearly assigned to her. She became the prostitute. She became the fallen woman, the redeemed sinner, the cautionary tale. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, the image of Mary as a woman defined by sexual sin became so dominant that many people stopped seeing everything else. The teacher disappeared. The disciple disappeared. The witness disappeared. The wisdom keeper disappeared. The woman herself disappeared beneath the story being told about her. And that fascinates me, because how many women throughout history know exactly what this feels like? To have one moment become their entire identity. To have one chapter become the whole book. To have someone else tell their story so often that eventually their own voice becomes difficult to hear. And perhaps that is one reason so many women are returning to Mary Magdalene right now. Because when they look at her, they recognize something very familiar. It's not perfection or sainthood. It's not an unreachable ideal. They recognize the experience of being misunderstood, the experience of carrying projections, the experience of surviving exile. And perhaps most importantly, they recognize the experience of finding themselves again afterward, because exile is never the end of the story. Sometimes exile is where the real story begins. So when people hear stories like mine, they often assume that the next chapter is quite simple. The church hurt me, so I left. The end. But life is rarely that neat. And if I'm being honest, leaving the church was one of the most disorienting experiences of my life. Because when you've built your entire understanding of reality inside of a particular structure, losing that structure feels like losing gravity. Suddenly the questions start multiplying. What do I believe? Who can I trust? Was any of it real? Was all of it real? How do I separate God from the people who claim to speak for God? How do I separate truth from tradition? How do I separate spirit from institution? These questions followed me around for years. And at first I did what many people do. I looked for answers. Books, teachers, podcasts, history, scripture, anything that might help me make sense of what had happened. But eventually I reached a point where I realized something. Everyone seemed to be telling me what I should think. And I was exhausted. Exhausted by experts, exhausted by certainty, exhausted by people insisting that they had the final answer. So one day, in complete sincerity, I prayed a prayer that would quietly change the course of my life. I said, Yeshua, I believe in you, but I don't believe them. Or at least I don't believe the version that they're presenting you as. I don't know what's true anymore. But if I'm going to believe anything from this point forward, it's going to be because you show me directly. And then I did something terrifying. I stopped pretending that I already knew the answers. I gave myself permission to ask questions, real questions, the kind of questions that make people uncomfortable, the kind of questions that can cost you belonging, the kind that can unravel entire worldviews. And what I discovered was that truth is rarely afraid of questions. Only systems are. The deeper I went, the more I encountered things that I had never been taught. Ancient texts, alternative traditions, lost voices, suppressed ideas, stories that did not fit neatly into the version of Christianity that I had inherited. And over again, I found myself encountering a figure who seemed to stand at the center of many of those conversations. Mary Magdalene. At first, I did not think much of it, but she just kept appearing. Different texts, different traditions, different perspectives, almost like a thread woven through centuries of spiritual inquiry. And eventually I began to ask myself, why? Why does she keep showing up? Why does this woman refuse to disappear? Why, after 2,000 years, are people still arguing about her, still seeking her, still trying to understand her? And one answer kept emerging again and again. Wisdom. Not knowledge, wisdom. Because in many of these traditions that I've been studying, Mary is associated with something much larger than herself. She becomes connected to Sophia directly. Divine wisdom. Now, Sophia is a vast subject that deserves an entire conference on her own, so I won't attempt to explain every nuance here with you today. But at its heart, Sophia represents wisdom that cannot simply be handed to you. Wisdom that must be lived, experienced. It emerges through that experience, through loss, through your questioning, through transformation. One of the traditions that fascinated me the most claims that the archons feared Mary Magdalene long before she ever met Yeshua. Long before the ministry, before the resurrection, long before she even became a teacher. The story suggests that they recognized something in her, something connected to Sophia, something connected to wisdom. And because of that, they sought to disrupt her life from the very beginning. Now, whether you understand archons literally, spiritually, psychologically, or symbolically, I think the underlying idea is still worth sitting with, because how many of us have looked back on our lives and noticed a pattern? The very gifts that we're born with seem to come with a counter resistance. The artist encounters discouragement. The healer encounters wounding. The truth teller encounters silencing. The leader encounters opposition. The wise keeper encounters misunderstanding. And perhaps the lesson isn't that we were broken. Perhaps the lesson is that power recognizes power. Perhaps the things that try hardest to suppress us are sometimes revealing exactly what we were here to become. When I look back at my own story, I sometimes wonder about that. Not because I think that I'm Mary Magdalene, far from it, but because I can clearly see how many times my voice was discouraged, dismissed, shamed, or silenced, and yet somehow that voice survived. Today, through the communities that we have built together online, I have the privilege of speaking to hundreds of thousands of people across multiple platforms. Many of them are women walking through their own season of questioning, deconstructing, healing, and awakening. And if there's one thing I would tell those women, it is this: do not assume that your wounds define your destiny. Sometimes the very places where life seems determined to break you are pointing toward the gifts that you actually came here to embody. If the Archon story teaches us anything, perhaps it is this: the presence of resistance is not always evidence that you're on the wrong path. Sometimes it is evidence that you're carrying something worth protecting. And the more I contemplated that idea, the more I realized something. The church had given me answers, but life gave me wisdom. The church had given me certainty, but the desert had given me the understanding. Because there are things that you can only learn when the map starts falling apart. There are things you can only learn when you no longer know where you're going. And there are things you can only learn when the people you trust can no longer tell you what to think. And perhaps that is why the desert appears in so many spiritual traditions. It's not a punishment. It's an initiation, a place where illusions die, a place where borrowed beliefs fall away, and where the soul learns to listen for itself. When I look back now, I can see that my exile became a desert, and my desert became a classroom. Not a comfortable classroom by any stretch of the imagination, but a classroom, not one I would have chosen. Because it taught me to trust my own experience. It taught me to sit with my uncertainty. It taught me that God is much larger than any institution. And perhaps, most importantly, it taught me that the search itself has value. It's sacred. That truth does not fear investigation. And somewhere along that road of seeking and questioning and studying and doubting and rebuilding and seeking again, I began to understand why Mary Magdalene continues to matter. Not because she gives us easy answers. It's because she reminds us that wisdom often emerges from the very places where certainty has collapsed. And perhaps that is why so many of us eventually find her. Because after exile and loss and disappointment, after the old stories fall away, we are finally ready to hear what wisdom has been trying to say to us all along. One of the things that I've learned over the years is that wisdom rarely arrives when we expect it to. Most of us imagine revelation as some dramatic event, a lightning bolt, a vision, a voice from heaven, but more often it arrives very quietly. A book finds its way into your hands. A question refuses to leave you alone. A symbol keeps appearing, or a story keeps resurfacing. A thread keeps tugging at your sleeve until eventually you stop and pay attention. And that's how Mary Magdalene returned to my life. She wasn't returning as a doctrine or a dogma, not as a demand, but as a question. A persistent question. Who was this woman really? Not who tradition says she was, not who culture says she was, but who was she really? And perhaps even more importantly, why do so many people seem determined to answer that question for her? As I began studying the traditions surrounding her life, I was struck by how different many of them felt from the version of Mary that I had inherited. Suddenly, I was encountering stories where she wasn't standing quietly in the background. She wasn't merely witnessing someone else's transformation. She was undergoing her own. She wasn't simply present. She was important. She was the second half of the whole story. And she wasn't simply following Yeshua. She was understanding. I would say even teaching on her own. And whether every one of those traditions is historically accurate is almost besides the point for me, because the deeper lesson wasn't about proving every story. The deeper lesson was realizing how much of her story had been left unexplored. And I found myself wondering how many women know what that feels like. To have only part of your story be told. To have others define it for you. To have entire dimensions of who you are ignored because they don't fit the narrative. Because the more I studied Mary, the more I realized I wasn't just learning about her. I was learning something about myself. I was learning something about women in general. I was learning something about wisdom. And perhaps most surprising, I was learning something about God, which I then learned was more of the goddess. Two aspects to the same Godhead. Because if my journey has taught me anything, it's that the divine is often hidden in the places that we've been taught not to look. In the rejected places and the forgotten places, the inconvenient places, the places like questions and mysteries and margins. And Mary Magdalene seems to stand at the intersection of all of those things. For much of my life, I believed that spiritual maturity meant becoming more certain. But now I'm not so sure. Now I think spiritual maturity may actually involve becoming more honest, more willing to say, I don't know. More willing to sit with the mystery, more willing to let a question remain open. And the traditions surrounding Mary Magdalene have helped me do exactly that. And this isn't because every question I had was answered, but because they invite me to ask better ones, better questions about wisdom and power and authority, questions about what happens when institutions tell one story while the soul is whispering another, questions about the feminine face of the divine, questions about Sophia, questions about what it means to seek truth with both courage and humility. And perhaps that is why Mary feels so relevant right now to all of us, and not just for women, but for everyone. Because we are living in a time when many old stories are breaking apart. Many inherited beliefs are being questioned. Many people are finding themselves standing in the same place that I once stood, wondering what remains when certainty disappears? What remains when institutions fail? When the story that you've been given no longer makes sense? And maybe that's why Mary keeps returning, because she stands as a reminder that wisdom is still available. The truth is still available. The Spirit is always available, even when the old maps stop working. Sometimes especially then. And when I look back across the winding path that brought me here, from the little girl trying to understand God, to the young woman searching for belonging, to the woman who found herself in exile, questioning, rebuilding, seeking again, I can see something now that I could not see then. A thread, a quiet thread running through all of it. A thread that kept pulling me to ask deeper questions, towards deeper honesty and deeper wisdom. And somehow woven into that thread was Mary Magdalene, waiting patiently, not to be worshipped, not to be placed on a pedestal, but to remind seekers like me that there is another way to walk this path, a way that's rooted not in fear or blind obedience or borrowed certainty, but in wisdom. And perhaps that is why all of these years I no longer feel like I found Mary Magdalene. I feel like Mary Magdalene found me. So as we come to the end of our time here together, I keep finding myself returning to one simple question. Why now? Why are so many people suddenly interested in Mary Magdalene again? Why are so many women feeling drawn to her story? Why, after nearly 2,000 years, are we still talking about her? I don't think it's because we're searching for another historical figure, and I don't think it's because we're trying to replace one religion with another. I think something much deeper is happening. I think many people are sensing that there are parts of ourselves that we have left behind, parts that we have been taught to distrust or to silence, parts we've been taught to hand over to someone else. Our intuition, our discernment, our relationship with the divine, our capacity to seek, our willingness to ask the difficult questions, our ability to recognize truth when we encounter it. And perhaps that is why Mary Magdalene keeps returning. Because whether you view her as a disciple or an apostle or a teacher, initiate, wisdom keeper, or simply a remarkable woman of history, she stands as a reminder that the divine has always been speaking. When I was younger, I thought faith meant having all the answers. Today, I think faith might look more like having the courage to continue seeking, to continue listening and asking and growing, even when it costs you your certainty, even when it costs you your belonging, even when it requires you to walk away from stories that no longer feel true. If my own journey has taught me anything, it's this. Losing an institution is not the same thing as losing God. Questioning a doctrine is not the same thing as abandoning truth. Walking away from fear is not the same thing as walking away from faith. In fact, sometimes the path back to the divine requires us to walk through one, if not all of those. And perhaps that is why Mary's story resonates so deeply with me personally, because when I look at her, I don't see perfection. I see courage. I see someone who remained present, devoted, someone who remained willing to seek understanding. Someone who, despite everything that history has said about her, still refuses to disappear. And maybe that's the real miracle here. Not that her story survived, but that her voice survived. That generation after generation of seekers continue to hear something in her story that's worth preserving, worth revisiting, worth reclaiming. And if I'm being completely honest, I think that's what we're doing here today. Not just studying Mary Magdalene, but remembering something. Remembering that wisdom matters, truth matters, love absolutely matters. Remembering that no institution, no empire, no gatekeeper, no authority has ever held a monopoly on the divine. The divine is bigger than all of that. The divine was speaking before us, and the divine will continue to speak after us. The divine is still speaking now. So if there's one thing that I hope that you carry home with yourself is this: do not be afraid of your questions. Do not be afraid of your seeking or the places where your soul is asking you to look more deeply, because truth does not fear investigation. Wisdom does not fear curiosity, and genuine love never asks you to abandon your discernment. Follow your thread. Follow the questions. Follow the things that make your soul come alive. And if along the way you find yourself standing at the edge of mystery, unsure of what comes next, take heart, because you are in very good company. After all, that is where many of the great seekers began. And perhaps this is where Mary Magdalene is still waiting for us. Thank you. And you're welcome.